Hey there, folks. Welcome to Module 7 of the Microsoft MD-102 course. Today's module is called Deploy using on-premises based tools. This module consists of three main sections we'll be going into. The first is Assess Deployment Readiness. The second is Deploy using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. And the last section we'll be covering, guys, is Deploy using Microsoft Configuration Manager. All right, folks, like usual, there you have it. That's the main sections we'll be covering in this specific module. If you guys haven't done it already, do your homie a favor and support the channel by giving it a like. And if you feel these are the kinds of videos you would like to continue watching, maybe consider subscribing. All right, guys, let's go learn something. All right, folks, let's jump into this first section, which is Assess Deployment Readiness. So the first thing we're going to be talking about in this section is deployment guidelines. Some of these things I'm about to mention to you folks are things you might know already. Some of them might be things you just didn't think of, and well, maybe some of them are things you didn't know. So the first thing is take inventory and establish infrastructure map. So before you can go and deploy, quite frankly, anything these days, you need to go and check your environment or your client's environment to go and check what they have. Do they, for example, have servers on premises? If they are on premises, are these physical? Are they virtual? Is it a mix? If they are virtual, what are we talking here? Are we talking Hyper-V? Are we talking VMware? What are we talking here? Go and check what the actual networking looks like. Do they, for example, have gigabit switches? Is it these 10 gigabit switches? What kind of network do they have? Is it a very old, outdated network, which is very slow? Is it the new, modern, fast network? Because all of these things can be what they call deployment blockers. They can basically be like a spanner in the works. It's not going to work out very nicely for you and your deployment staff. Something else you can go and do is identify devices to retire. I suppose you can think of this as a little bit of spring cleaning. So at any point in time, whenever you're about to go and deploy something, go and check in your environment or your client's environment if there's anything that needs to be retired or anything that you can go and retire. Everything has a circle of life, and eventually everything needs to be retired. Not just hardware, guys, also software. The bullet point I listed there is simply referring to hardware in this instance, but this is sometimes software too. At some point in time, all service, all everything comes to an end of life. Then get yourself a strategy for supporting complex application installs. It's not always going to be a straightforward process. There's going to be times when you or your client is going to have very complicated applications that needs to be installed. It's not always as simple as just installing the prerequisites and there you go, there we can go and install the application itself. You're going to have to go and sit down with what we call your stakeholders, basically anyone that's got an interest in the success or failure of this project. Go and discuss what are these applications, what do we need to put in place, and what do we need to go and do to get these applications to actually go and work. Then determine opportunities for virtualization. Now I think this kind of feels redundant at this point in time because majority of companies out there are for the most part fully virtualized or fully in the cloud these days. But if you or your client happen to be in a sticky situation where some, if not most of your stuff has not been virtualized yet, maybe, just maybe, use this opportunity to go and check if there's not something you can go and virtualize. Whether it be an application, whether it be a whole flippin' server, you name it, go and sit down, go and check. Okay, boys, is there anything that we can go and virtualize at this point in time? Since we're at it anyway, we might as well go for it, you know? Then establish data migration process. There's going to most likely be a situation where you're going to have to go migrate your data, you're going to have to go and back up the data. So how, where, and when do you plan on migrating this data? You're going to have to go down and have a discussion about that. And speaking of backing up, establish method for backing up data on devices where applicable. It's most likely going to be applicable. Let's face it. I mean, when last have you seen a situation where you don't need to go and back up? It's probably going to be applicable. The only time I've seen it's not applicable is if you've got your stuff in the cloud in some instances. Establish a deployment plan describing the complete process. Never mind establishing a deployment plan. You should also go and discuss this to a certain extent of the with the users, mind you. So if you're gonna go and deploy something new and funky in your environment or the client's environment next month, maybe invite them to the boardroom during lunchtime. Tell them, okay, boys and girls, this is what we're going to be doing in the next upcoming month. You're gonna be seeing these changes. This is how it's going to affect you. This is what you're gonna be doing from now on. It's just good to educate them and to keep them in the loop so that people don't just go into a panic state when a sudden change happens. It's more going to be a gradual transitioning phase, if you will. Lastly, guys, create a training and post deployment plan. Kind of refers back to what I just said. So once you have deployed all of this, or maybe even before or during, start training your staff or the users of your client. Tell them, boys and girls, this is what we're going to be deploying. This is why we're going to be deploying it. This is what it's used for. This is how you guys can go and use it. I'm not saying you need to go and do an advanced, sophisticated course like what you guys are doing. No, you can just go and invite them into the boardroom maybe a couple of times, half an hour at a time, have a cup of coffee, maybe a sandwich or whatever, while you discuss it on the projector or something like that. And before you know it, everybody knows what they need to go and do. If need be, you can even do this remotely over something like Microsoft Teams or Zoom, because let's face it, more than half of people are working from home these days. So if that happens to be the situation, you know what? Just make a giant meeting on Teams, schedule over lunchtime or something like that, and just basically show everybody the basics of what they need to know. Right, folks, and then next up we've got Readiness Tools. Basically, in a nutshell, tools that you or your staff can go and use to check the readiness of your environment or your client's environment. Starting things off with Microsoft Intune. I mean, no surprise there. This whole flipping course is all about Microsoft Intune, quite frankly. So as we know, probably by now, I mean, we're in module 7, so you would definitely know by now that Microsoft Intune can be used to see a lot of stuff about your users and their devices, regardless of where they might be. The only real catch here is, in most cases, these devices needs to be enrolled into a company's Intune environment. So coming at this from a readiness perspective, to go and check if your environment, the devices, the users are ready, mostly the devices, Microsoft Intune provides key management capabilities in application delivery, desktop virtualization, device management, and security. Just in case you didn't know, organizations using Microsoft Intune can view reports and run queries on the assets it manages, including complete inventory of the operating system, software, and hardware. I've said it before, I'll say it again. You can see pretty much exactly what kind of device this user has. Would it be a tablet, phone, laptop, desktop? You can see what operating system is on it. Would it be Windows, iOS, Android, Linux? You can see the build, the edition, the version. You can see what drivers are installed, updates are installed, applications are installed. Never mind seeing, you can actually do. You can install or uninstall all of the above. So yeah, no, this is a really, really rad tool. But we're not talking about deploying here. We're talking about just checking readiness. So if you want to go and check if the devices are ready, yes, you can use Intune since you can see pretty much everything anyway. So yeah, you might as well put it to some good use. And then, folks, we've got the tool Endpoint Analytics. Endpoint Analytics is a cloud-based service that provides insights for measuring how your organization is working and the quality of the experience you're delivering to your users. Endpoint Analytics provides Windows 11 hardware readiness supports that shows which devices are capable of running Windows 11. And obviously, since we know Microsoft's going to be forcing us onto Windows 11 very shortly, I think this is going to be very handy for a lot of you guys if you happen to have access to this nifty little tool. So if your company is not on Windows 11 yet, get ready, guys. Microsoft's got a habit of forcing people onto what they want. So I think at this point in time, when I'm making this video, about 80% of people are on Windows 10. I think it's about 5 to 10% are on Windows 11. And then the last 5 or 10% is just all the other previous legacy Windows operating systems. So you can see still a lot of people on Windows 10 at this point. I mean, up to 80% for crying out loud. And we at the moment when I'm making this video, it's August 2023. That doesn't mean it's not valid by the time you guys watch this. I mean, this content is going to stay valid for a very long time. So even if you're watching this a couple of months, couple of years afterwards, at the end of the day, 1 plus 1 will always be 2, folks. Anyway, moving on to the next topic. Assess applications compatibility. Now, looking at the title and reading that, I think you guys can kind of guess or assume what this would be about. And it's common sense to obviously go and check if any application is going to be working in your environment or your client's environment before you actually go ahead and just say, hey, let's get this application, boys. Or hey, let's deploy this application. No, you can't just go and do that. You need to verify and make absolutely sure that it's actually compatible and that it's going to work. Otherwise, you can end up making a fool of yourself. And quite frankly, it's just going to be a lot of work to sort out the mess afterwards. So yeah, first things first. Apps that run on Windows 7, Windows 8 and 8.1 will typically work on Windows 11 and later. So that's the good news here. If they work on Windows 7 or 8, the chances are they will most likely work on Windows 10 or 11. However, you should still test compatibility, guys. Do not assume. Just because it's most likely going to work, 90-something% chance it's going to work, do not assume, because if you do assume and it ends up not working, can you imagine how awkward that would be? You're going to make a fool of yourself. And like I said, it's going to be a heck of a lot of work to go and sort out that mess afterwards. Never assume, always test. So when it comes to you running into a snag where it may or may not run on Windows 11, there's a couple of mitigations you can go and use within Windows 11. The list I'm about to give you guys is not everything. This is just to give you guys a ballpark idea. So first of all, try modifying the app. I think a lot of guys are probably going to try and sidestep this one because it sounds like a lot of work. Alternatively, get updates from the developer. You might find there's a update available. Maybe, especially when Windows 10 is going to start becoming popular, developers will probably start uploading more and more updates, for their apps, and that's 10 to 1 going to solve any bugs or glitches that might be exposed during that time. You can also go and try and upgrade if available. Try and upgrade your operating system, but I think they're most likely referring to upgrading the application itself to a newer and better version. You can go and modify security configuration if that happens to be a snag. Run the application virtualized. Now, this can mean a lot of things, guys. That's all that Microsoft says. So this is probably going to refer to you running it in a virtual machine, something like Hyper-V or VMware. So maybe your operating system on the host is Windows 11 for yourself or this user, but the application you or the user needs to run does not run on Windows 11, but they absolutely need this application. In that instance, one of many things you can go and do is just make a virtual machine on Windows 11, because that is something you can go and do, assuming you're running professional enterprise. Make a virtual machine, just don't install Windows 11 on that virtual machine, otherwise you're back in the same boat. Install something older on it, maybe Windows 10 or something older, and then run the application on the virtual machine. I suppose you can also go run this as a remote app, as an application virtualization scenario, Also, go check out compatibility mode, guys. 1 out of 2 times, this actually does solve my problem. Microsoft probably love you to believe that this solves the problem every time. No. I have to disagree with Microsoft on that one. I've seen only like 1 out of every 2 times does it actually work. So if you go and right click on the icon of the application or the game in question, yes, I said game because this might even be a game. I mean, some of you guys are gamers. Right click on the icon for the game and application, go to compatibility tab, and there you will see there's a drop down list where you can go and choose in compatibility mode for what do you want to run this application. So if you're doing this on Windows 11 and you know for a fact this program works just fine on Windows 10, from the drop down list, go choose Windows 10. It's going to run the program as if it's running on Windows 10. Now, saying it like that makes it sound like it's guaranteed to work. I mean, you would think it would, but no, sometimes it just doesn't. So it's a 50-50. I mean, you've got nothing to lose, you've got something to gain. It's worth the shot. It's quite frankly the easiest one out of the lot, so I would suggest you try that one first, guys. Oh, yeah, and then lastly, if all else fails, explore alternative apps. That's not, of course, assuming there are alternative apps out there. I had a client once, which was on mine, and this was the point in time when everybody was migrating to Windows 10. So I'm talking about quite a few years ago. I think this was 2017, 2018. Huge mine. And they had an application which was only working on Windows 7 at the time. They wanted to go and upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Had an application on Windows 7. It only works on Windows 7. It's for the minds. And there's absolutely nothing else like it on the market. Nothing. So they have to use this application. At the same time, they have to switch to Windows 10. So there's a bit of a conundrum. So yeah, sometimes there might not be alternative applications. You have to refer to one of the previous mitigations we just listed here for you guys, like using a virtual machine, running the app as a remote app, running the app as an app v app, possibly looking at something like remote desktop. Yo, I'm giving a lot of extra ones here, which is not even on this list of Microsoft, but there you go. There's a couple extra mitigations I gave you guys by accident. Now, speaking of a couple of extra mitigations, here Microsoft gives us a list of tools for application compatibility migration. So the first one on this list, there's going to be four guys, is Application Compatibility Toolkit. So this is a set of tools used during the inventory, analyze, and mitigate phases of the application compatibility testing process. The Application Compatibility Toolkit consists of several features, folks, including a database of known application issues and mitigations for those issues. I mean, how cool and useful is that? The Compatibility Administrator tool that can be used to create fixes for your applications to enable them to run correctly. A Setup Analysis tool that helps identify problems with application setup. The standard user analyzer that can identify issues with UAC restrictions that might affect your application's functionality, and of course there's obviously a few more that I did not mention. So this application compatibility toolkit can diagnose application compatibility issues in Windows, guys, obviously. Depending on the type of incompatibility issues that you encounter, the automatic compatibility toolkit can also solve application compatibility problems for you automatically. Quite nifty, right? That's really something I would enjoy. One of the greatest benefits of this is that it can provide a solution that requires no significant change to the user's operating system environment, and it mitigates compatibility issues by attaching shims to apps. Shims that redirect calls from apps to the appropriate location in Windows. They also simulate the operating system components that the app is attempting to access. These fixes, guys, can be applied as part of an application's deployment. So this all happens during the deployment. It has not even fully been deployed yet. It's going to identify issues and it's going to go and fix them for you. Really, really, really cool to go and use this automatic compatibility toolkit. Something else is, of course, Client Hyper-V, which I did mention previously. So Client Hyper-V, for those of you that's not familiar, is used to create virtual machines. This is one of Microsoft's platforms to create virtual machines. And a virtual machine obviously has its own operating system. So, like one of my previous examples that I gave you guys accidentally, if you find yourself in a sticky situation where you need to run an application on your machine or your client's machine, and it's not compatible with the operating system, which is probably going to be Windows 11, you can go and use Client Hyper-V to make a virtual machine which has a different operating system. Something older, most likely, something like Windows 10, Windows 8, or Windows 7, whatever operating system you need to run the application in question. It's got its whole own operating system, its whole everything. It just doesn't have any physical hardware, and it's going to take that obviously from the host. Then we've got, of course, remote desktop services, also something I mentioned accidentally previously. So you can essentially, or your users, quite frankly, can go and remote desktop somewhere else where the program is installed and running. So you can now go and install this program and run it somewhere else, somewhere like a server, and then your users or your client's users can just remote desktop to that environment, probably a server, and they can just access it remotely. So that's probably also a very quick and easy solution to go and use. The last one on my list here, guys, is Azure Virtual Desktop. I suppose we can also call this Windows 365. Very much the same as the second point I made for you guys. It's essentially still a virtual machine. Difference being it's not running on your environment, it's cloud. So if you're using something like Hyper-V, yes, virtual machine. It's exactly like a real computer, just doesn't have its own hardware. Where does it get it from? Your machine, your host machine. Now, if you look at Azure virtual desktops and virtual machines and all those, pretty much the same kind of worms, except instead of it taking from your resources, it's taking it from Microsoft. So your users will essentially be able to access a virtual environment which is running somewhere else, Microsoft's environment in this case, and you can go and install whatever application you want to go and install that side, and people just access it remotely via, well, the internet, quite frankly. Now, folks, something else you can go and do, which is probably one of the most important things to go and do here, and I did kind of indirectly mention this earlier, is to never assume something would work. So if we look at something like an application, Never assume, test it, is what I said earlier. So with that in mind, you should go and plan a pilot. Yes, I know it's not always possible. This obviously varies from company to company. Every company is unique, just like people. Some of them have got lots of money, some of them don't. Some of them have test environments, some of them don't. Some of them have skilled staff, some of them don't. It's very, very unique. But if at all possible, and it probably will be possible, plan a pilot. So if you don't know what a pilot is, guys, that is when you go run a much smaller version of this deployment, whatever it might be, whether it be an operating system or application. You only go and deploy it to a select few of people. So we can go and thumbsuck it here and say, hey, you've got a company of a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand users. And instead of deploying this application or this operating system, whatever it is, to everybody, you are only going to deploy it to, let's say, 20 or 30 people. It could be more, it could be less, but it's normally around there. 20 or 30 people. Ideally, guys, these folks, these 20 or 30 people, needs to be in different departments, different rank. They need to have different privilege. They need to be as diverse as possible. Otherwise, your pilot, which is essentially a test, is going to be inaccurate. It doesn't help if you get 20 or 30 people and all 20 or 30 of them are in the same department of the same rank and the same privilege. Maybe you had no issues during this pilot, or it was minimal, you solved them all, and now eventually when you go and roll this out to the whole company in full, you're going to encounter a lot of unforeseen issues you were not aware of. So that is why you need to go and deploy this to at least one user in every department of every different kinds of privilege you can get, so that if there are any issues, you would be aware of them and you can start taking care of them, start looking at mitigations for these issues. And that on the day when you're going to deploy this to the whole company in full, then hopefully you've solved most of the issues. And there's bound to be a couple of new issues as well. There's always going to be issues, but hopefully you would have taken care of most of them. All right, so with regards to planning a pilot, use deployment rings for a phased deployment, guys. So phase one, IT and early adopters. So these early adopters, I'm actually surprised Microsoft calls them early adopters. Microsoft normally calls them pilot users, or as I like to call them, guinea pigs. Just don't call them that to their faces because they don't like it very much and they're not going to be very keen on helping you. Call them a pilot user or an early adopter. Make them sound very, very important. And you're going to find that when people feel very important, they're going to be a lot more keen to help you out. I sound mean when I say it like that, but it is what it is, guys. So yeah, phase two, get your pilot group. Phase three, broad production rollout. So that's obviously now once you've gotten feedback from your pilot users. This could take weeks, could take months. Get feedback, solve the issues as necessary, fix them and all that. And then eventually you go and roll out to the whole company, and then hopefully, fingers crossed, the issues will be minimal. It's never going to be zero. If it's minimal or if it's zero, then definitely please leave a comment down below. Let me know if you had zero issues, because it's almost never zero issues. Right, so also in planning a pilot, establish communication and training plans. How do you plan on informing everybody, IT and otherwise, about this deployment? And how do you plan on training everybody, both IT staff and non-IT staff? How do you plan on training it? So you're going to have to go and sit down and have discussions about this. And lastly, guys, document and collect feedback. Something I've mentioned quite a few times now. So get feedback from your users during the pilot phase, and also get feedback from them after it's been rolled out. Yes, just because it's been rolled out to the whole company does not mean you should not get feedback from them. There could be unforeseen issues that's only going to make its appearance once the whole thing has been deployed to the whole company. So if you've got a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand users in your company, your client's company, you're probably not going to want to go and sit down with every user. That's just crazy. So what I used to go and do, and you're allowed to copy me, guys, by all means, copy paste my idea. Sit down with the line managers. If possible, get them in the same room, same meeting. Sit down in a room, boardroom or whatever. Get the HR manager, IT manager, sales manager, marketing manager. Get the bosses in there, all of them preferably. And then you hear from them. Maybe talk to the sales manager. Say, hey, my bro, has there been any issues that you are aware of in your sales department? Any complaints that your users have been complaining about since the rollout? Obviously, they should know what's going on in the department. Otherwise, what the heck are they doing there? So just speak to the line managers and they ideally would know what's going on in their environments. And then instead of you speaking to a lot of people, you just speak to a couple of people, most likely in one meeting, and it's going to be a lot quicker and a lot easier. Don't work harder, work smarter, as the saying goes. And that, folks, brings us finally to the end of the first main section in this module. Let's go take a look at the second main section, which was called Deploy using Microsoft's Deployment Toolkit. The first thing I'm going to be taking you folks through in this section is evaluating traditional deployment methods. So traditionally, we for the most part used images, and it's still actually very, very popular till this day. So I've got a bit of a table here for you guys, as you can see. On the left, we've got a default image. On the right, we've got a custom image. We're basically going to go and check pros and cons, if you want to call it that. So if you don't know what an image is, guys, I think everybody would know what an image is if you're watching this course. But an image is when you go and capture a Windows operating system, possibly you have certain applications and drivers and stuff pre-installed. So a default image is, well, pretty much blank. This can just be a normal Windows 10 or normal Windows 11 image. And when you go and deploy this to a user's device, he or she would have Windows 10 or 11 installed essentially. But that's pretty much it. You would still have to go and do everything afterwards. You would still have to go and install the applications, most likely, the drivers, most likely, the updates, most likely. But it's got benefits to it, to using a default image. They're a little bit easier to maintain, quite frankly. But there's still a lot of work you've got to go and do afterwards. So I would say post-deployment, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. With a custom image on the right-hand side, yeah, maintaining it is a bit of a schlep, but the benefits really outweighs the drawbacks here, because once it's deployed, you're pretty much going to go and do nothing because it's done. And deployment is a heck of a lot quicker because, well, everything is done. So yeah, looking at the left side of the table, no need to create an image. It's just a default image of Windows 10 or 11. Applications and settings must be applied separately. Yeah, because it's just a bare metal operating system. It's just Windows 10 or 11 and pretty much nothing else. So you or the user would still have to go and install the applications, configure settings and all that afterwards. It's a bit of a schlep. One image per architecture. So if you want 32-bit or 64-bit or you want both of them, you can have an image for 32-bit and you're going to have an image for 64-bit. Updates to applications do not require the image to be rebuilt. Yes, because the image is just a bare metal one. It literally contains just Windows 10 or 11. It might be a very old build, it might not be. At the end of the day, if you're going to go and update, it's going to go and update the operating system that's now already been deployed, and the image itself is going to remain untouched. Something that's not going to apply to a custom image. Overall deployment time is typically slower, and the reason for that is because you still have to go and do all the nonsense afterwards. You still have to go and install the applications. You still need to install the drivers and the updates and do any configurations. It's just a lot of work. I get tired just thinking about it. And then, guys, some applications can be difficult to automate the installation. So yeah, it's a bit of an inconvenience. Looking at the right side of this table, when it comes to custom images, I think you guys can probably hear in the tone of my voice that I'm more in favor of the custom image. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be sunshine and rainbows all the way, but it is the better one out of the two, in my opinion. So looking at a custom image must be created and maintained. So if you are the person tasked with creating this, you're going to have to go and choose what applications you want included in this, what drivers, what updates, what settings. Then you capture it as an image, and then one day if you go and deploy this to a machine, the machine would not just have Windows 10 or 11 installed on it, it would already have all the application settings, drivers, and all that stuff installed already. See where we're going with this? There's the benefits now. So applications and settings can be included in the custom image, and that's normally one of the reasons why we do this. It's probably going to be included. The configuration and application requirements of each group within an organization can typically require several images to be created and maintained. Updates to applications cause images to become stale, requiring images to be updated or recreated. Yep. So there's going to be times when you just need to go and add a new driver or a new update, and you can actually just go and inject this to your existing image. Yes, that is something you can go and do. You can go and inject something like a driver, a new driver, into your old existing image. But there's going to be a tipping point in time when you might have to go and recreate the whole image altogether. And guys, it is a lot of work. You normally want to try and avoid that. Overall deployment time is typically faster with the configurations and applications included in the image because you don't have to go and do it afterwards. You just start the process, you go for lunch, you come back, and it's done. How awesome is that? When applications are installed on the reference machine, they are typically easier to deploy when included with the image. Yep. Alright, so that is pretty much everything I've got to say about this little table, folks. Let us move on. Set up the Microsoft's deployment toolkit for client deployment. So that being said, the Microsoft deployment toolkit is a unified collection of tools, guys. It's not a tool, it's a collection of tools for processes and guidance for automating desktop and server deployment. It is still very popular till this day, but I would not say it's the only tool people go out and use. MDT is a Microsoft tool at the end of the day, and you'll find there's a lot of companies out there that do not necessarily even use a Microsoft tool. This course exclusively covers just the Microsoft side of deployment. It gives us just Microsoft tools and just Microsoft solutions. But that's Microsoft. Microsoft's not going to be caught dead mentioning something that's not Microsoft because it's bad for business. But in real life, guys, I can tell you now, many companies do not necessarily use MDT, not because it's bad. I mean, it's not a bad tool. It's just it simply does not meet their unique needs and their unique requirements. Anyway, but coming at this from an MDT perspective, the Microsoft side of the coin, it reduces deployment time and standardizes images, supports Windows client and server deployment. So you can do either or. And when it comes to the setup prerequisites, of course, there's going to be prerequisites. You need to have Active Directory Domain Services environment, Windows Server 2016 or later. I mean, if you're going to tell me you're not running Server 2016 or later, I'm going to have a couple of questions. If anyone that is watching this video is not running Server 2016 and you're running something older than that, please drop a comment down below. Let me know what you're running in your environment and why you're running such an old server environment. I'm sure there's probably a very good reason for it, which is why I'm asking. You also need to have Windows ADK, of course, Windows Deployment Services, and lastly, guys, Windows Server Update Services, which I suppose a lot of us just call WSUS. I always just call it WSUS for short. But you need to have that, otherwise, how do you plan on updating all of this jazz? Alright, still moving on. Manage and deploy images using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. So, first of all, create a reference image. Most of you guys probably know that part already. So, you're first going to have to go and create yourself a reference image, a baseline, if you will. Add an application to that captured image. So, any application or applications, it's most likely going to be more than one, but this course is coming at it as if it's just one, but in real life we know it's probably going to be more than one application. Once you've done that, deploy a reference image with a task sequence. So this is a sequential set of steps that will reference various components imported into your Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. These components are things like gather, which collects information locally and stores it as variables for using during the task sequence. It's things like format and partition disk. So this formats and creates an appropriate disk layout for the target endpoint. You've got things like apply operating system image. So this applies a standard Windows image or a custom WIM file from a previously ran captured process. You can go and inject drivers, which allows specific drivers to be applied to a certain target device. And install applications, of course, which allows for an application imported in MDT to be installed sequentially. And there you have it, folks. Moving on. Manage and deploy images using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. So the title is not really changing. So something you guys need to be aware of, you most likely know this already, is you get different kinds of deployment in the sense of how much interaction there will be from the user or the administrator in most cases. The first, the most obvious, and the most widely used one is user-driven installation, which is known as UDI for short. At least that's what Microsoft calls it in this specific course. That's not how I know it. I know this is a high-touch installation. So you get high-touch installation, which is normally what we call it. Not user-driven, but I suppose user-driven is another way you can go and call it. It means the installation or the deployment requires a high level of interaction from the user. So you or the user needs to do everything. If you're about to install Windows or about to install a program, You're going to click on next. You're going to go and choose the installation location, the language, this and that. Pretty much everything is done manually by you or the user. So that's what they mean by user-driven installation or a high-touch installation. Then, folks, you get what we call a light touch installation. This is when there's some level of automation involved. MDT is actually a very good example of that. You know, that Microsoft Deployment Toolkit we spoke of earlier. So MDT can essentially get you to a light touch installation, also sometimes known as a low touch installation. So light touch, you spell it like light mayonnaise, or low touch, same thing, potato, is when there's some level of interaction, but not full interaction. It's somewhat automated. So you've got answer files running or something like that. You might just check if the machine is turned on, if it's connected to the Wi-Fi or connected to a network cable. You start the process, you go out for lunch, you come back after lunch, the deployment is done for the most part. So that would be an example of light touch. Most of the work is done for you, but you or the user or the administrator still have to intervene a little bit there. The last one here, which I think speaks for itself now after what I just explained, is zero touch installation. I'm currently not aware of another name for this one. I think it's just called zero touch. I know user driven was high touch. Light touch is sometimes known as low touch. Zero touch is just, well, zero touch as far as I know. So that is when the deployment or installation is 100% automated. And one of the only ways we achieve that is to go and use SCCM. And I'm not just saying that because it's a Microsoft tool. This is a Microsoft course. It just so happens to be the main tool of choice when it comes to getting to a 100% automated environment. So this could be something you scheduled like a month ago. A month ago, you scheduled everybody to go and upgrade from Windows 10 to 11. This morning, you get to the office, you see you've got Windows 11 on your machine now. You're scratching your head, squinting your eyes at the screen, wondering what is going on here. And then you remember, oh, that's right. I scheduled this a month ago. Oopsie daisy, forgot about it. Right, guys, that brings us to the end of the second main section. Moving on to the third and the last one, which is deploy using Microsoft's Configuration Manager. Okay, folks, let's start with client deployment using Microsoft Configuration Manager. That's what we're going to start with in this section. So the role of Microsoft Configuration Manager in a modern desktop journey has somewhat changed. So if you go look at things in the old days versus how we do things these days, times have certainly changed. So up until not too long ago, as recently as 5 to 10 years ago, the average person would come into the office, sit at the office, do their work there on their laptop or desktop, and that was how things were. Servers were for the most part physical back then, and then about 5 to 10 years ago, we slowly started moving towards virtual, where our servers started becoming virtual more and more often. They were still on premises for the most part, but they started moving towards virtual at least. And then we started getting introduced into cloud and remote connectivity. So I'm not saying they were not around, it's just, well, they were not exactly popular. Now we're sitting at a point in time where half of our staff, if not more for some companies, are working from home or wherever now. They don't necessarily use a laptop or a desktop. This can be a tablet or phone. They don't necessarily use a device that belongs to your company. It might be a BYOD scenario. It belongs to them. And this brings about, as I've said previously in this course, a whole new can of worms when it comes to you managing these users, their devices, and everything they need. How do you give people what they need? And how do you do things like monitor them and all that if they're not at the office, if they're not using Windows, and if it's not necessarily your devices? Brings about a whole can of worms, doesn't it? So with modern management tools such as Intune and Autopilot and the innovative changes to Microsoft Configuration Manager, it can now act as a bridge between how things were done and how things can be done in a more modern and agile way. So if you look at things like Intune, you can monitor people wherever the heck they might be, and you can give them what they need. If you look at things like Autopilot, which has been discussed in this course before in previous modules, that's a great way to provision people's machines if you've never actually seen these little buggers or even touched them. So they go into a store, go buy a new laptop, they go home, and now suddenly they need an operating system and software. How are you going to give it to them? I mean, that thing is not on your Intune environment. It doesn't have the configuration manager agent or client on it. So how do you plan on giving that person what they need? That's where Autopilot comes into play, boys and girls. So building on the foundations of MDT, access to a wider expanse of task sequences variables with which to utilize during your operating system deployment. So they give you that and amongst many other things. The MDT rules engine offers a raft of built-in options which aid operating system deployment, the ability to install Windows features without the knowledge of code, and lastly, log file collection out of a template task sequence wizard. And there's obviously more that's not even mentioned here, guys. A lot more, guys. It actually offers a lot more. Okay, but guys, this configuration manager, like I said just a moment ago, offers a raft of capabilities, most of which fit into deployment strategy in some shape or form. Many enterprises use configuration manager for its single pane of glass methodology to maintain devices, whether this is the delivery of the operating system and applications, or the servicing and management of the device. The single pane of glass methodology brings disparate systems together into one system. With the use of co-management for the modern transition and the endpoint manager console, the ever-evolving sync between the two has made the investment in configuration manager even more valuable, guys. So some of the key elements that configuration manager offers, just in case you are curious what some of these extra elements are that I've been bragging about, is things like operating system deployment, application management, update management, servicing management, device inventory, basic license tracking, self-service software catalog, cloud management capability, real-time query and reporting, enterprise scalability, Azure Active Directory integration, proactive cadence adoption through desktop analytics, remote control, and lastly, folks, user settings capture and restore. So the introduction of Cloud Management Gateway has become crucial to enabling enterprises to service their clients with the recent surge in remote working, as you guys can imagine, meaning this is one of the most heavily utilized modern features within this platform. Pretty cool, right? Now, speaking of cool, looking at deployment components of the Microsoft Configuration Manager, that would be obviously boot images in the MDT and Configuration Manager. So these boot images, they basically initiate the deployments, which can obviously be accessed via CD, DVD, ISO, USB, or network mediums. So as long as you go and initiate it, that's what's going to happen. This can be 32-bit platforms, can be 64-bit platforms, and it's all customizable. When it comes to the actual operating system images, folks, that is stored in a WIM format, WIM as some people call it, and it's based on the default operating system or an image from the reference computer which we spoke about earlier. As for the device drivers, should you find yourself in a need of that, which you probably will, Driver Catalog enables the installation of device drivers without including the operating system image. When it comes to the software updates you probably will need, tools and resources to help manage tracking and applying software are available. So that's obviously going to be things like your configuration manager, Intune, and much more. Lastly, folks, task sequences. So this is to automate software updates, applications, and your cloud management gateway. All right, folks, and then let's move on to the last topic in this section and for this module, but please don't disappear once we're done with this. I've got a couple of things I need to say. That is in-place upgrades using Microsoft Configuration Manager. I think a lot of you folks probably know what an in-place upgrade is. If you don't, that means you or the user or the device has an existing operating system on it and you would like to upgrade it to something newer and better. An example would be a device, a computer that's got Windows 10 installed, and you would like to upgrade that device to have Windows 11 installed instead. So you're moving from the previous operating system to a newer and a better. But there's T's and C's that apply to that, which we'll get to in just a second. So in-place upgrade is the recommended path to Windows 10 or 11. That's assuming, of course, you've got a previous operating system installed. They don't mention that here. In-place upgrade leverages Windows setup and preserves all data, settings, apps, and drivers. So they say, but what they don't tell you is it tends to have a couple of bugs and glitches from time to time. You may possibly need to go and reinstall certain applications like the antivirus I've seen. It's not a lot of work, but it is a bit of a schlep. MDT and Microsoft's Configuration Manager task sequences can be used to perform in-place upgrades. So if you're lazy, you can go make use of that. Let's face it, most of us are. Can be rolled back to previous installed operating system if needed for troubleshooting purposes. Yes. So never mind using Microsoft's Configuration Manager to get this done, even if you just go do it old school, manually. So if you've got Windows 8 or 10 installed and you do a manual in-place upgrade by literally just putting in the DVD or something like that, old school, guys, for 50 days, you can go roll back to the previous operating system. That used to be a question in the previous MD-100 exam. But at the moment, I think they probably removed that. I don't think that's going to be a question exam, but in case it is, now you know. You've got 30 days. So if you're the user, go and upgrade a machine, let's say you're going to do an in-place upgrade, whether it be, manually in person, whether it is you using another tool like Configuration Manager, you've got 30 days. After 30 days, you're going to have to go and back up everything on that machine. If everything needs to be backed up, you're going to have to do a wipe and load and do it from scratch. It's tedious. You want to try and avoid that. So make sure everything is hunky-dory within the first day or so that you can just go and say roll back and then you literally just forget about it. It's easy, easy. Lastly, guys, considerations for an in-place upgrade. They make it sound very straightforward and easy. It is not. You can only upgrade, first of all, if you have an existing operating system, like I said before. Now, it doesn't stop there. If you want to go and upgrade, you have to stay in the same architecture path. So if you're currently running a 64-bit operating system of, let's say, Windows 10, you can only upgrade to another 64-bit operating system, which will probably be Windows 11. So architecture-wise, you have to stay in your lane. If you're running 32-bit, you can only upgrade to other 32-bit operating systems. If you're running 64-bit, same kind of worms. And you preferably want to stay in your lane as well when it comes to the addition of Windows. So if you're running Windows 10, let's say Enterprise, try and stick to Enterprise, go to Windows 11 Enterprise. And if you're running Home or Basic or something like that, and you want to suddenly switch over to Enterprise or vice versa, no, guys. The features and the functions and all that's going to be a mismatch. It's not going to work. Stay in your lane of the architecture. Stay in your lane of the addition. If you would like to switch additions or architecture, it is possible, but then you're going to have to do a wipe and load. So if anything needs to be backed up, you back it up, wipe everything, and you do a clean installation. Alright folks, that brings us to the end of the last section in this module. I thank you very much for watching up until this point. If you've got any questions, please drop those in the comment section down below. There is only one module left for this course, which is going to be Module 8. It's going to follow this one shortly. And should Microsoft change the final version of this course, because as I'm making this Module 7, the official course has not been released yet to the public. But should Microsoft change their mind and change the course, I will also change my course to, well, adapt accordingly to help you guys pass the exam. Alright guys, a special shout out and thank you to all the sponsors and supporters of this channel. Thank you very much to everybody that's been clicking on the thanks button below the video. Thank you to those of you that's been making donations. There's a list of the Patreon sponsors. Thank you very, very much guys. I appreciate you. There's a list of the PayPal sponsors. Thank you very much. If anyone else wants to make donations or support the channel, you can find that in the video description down below. And speaking of down below in the video description, there you will find a link to my Discord server. So if anyone has Discord or knows what Discord is, I've got a Discord server. It's an IT community. It's called Free IT Training. It's completely for free. You'll find people like myself, like-minded people, other people that's studying and whatever on that server. And yeah, if you're studying for a course like this one, you will find resources there. You can even ask me questions or someone else questions. And if you feel like you want to help someone else, you can do that there. All completely for free. Right guys, and obviously you'll find in the video description there's nice convenient timestamps like usual as well. Righty! Speak to you guys again in the last module, which is module 8 of the MD-102.